Welcome to day 2 of TheiaCon 2023. I really enjoyed the sessions yesterday, and I hope you did so too. And I'm also really looking forward to today's program. Make sure you check out all the available talks on Swapcard, and we hope you enjoyed the second day as well. It's also my pleasure to tell you we are close to an all-time record in terms of registration. I think there's only one person missing to reaching 400 registration, which is really an amazing number. Right, without further ado, let me get into the topic of my talk today. I'm Jonas Helming. I work for EclipseSource. We are a company focused on building tools and IDEs for various customers. And in this role, we are also often participating in technology decisions. And one technology discussion or decision that has been, or that is important in many, many projects these days when building web-based tools and IDEs is the selection of the underlying platform. And today I wanted to talk about this decision, specifically about two very common choices. That's Eclipse Theia and Code OSS, which is the open source project behind VS Code. Maybe to give you some hints in case you are about to do a similar decision between these two technologies. Quick disclaimer, of course, I cannot do the decision for you. It's a very important topic where you should spend some time in the evaluation. But what I want to do is transfer some of the standard arguments and criteria that might provide valuable input for your own decision. But please take the time and look at this more carefully. Now, what do these two technologies provide to you? They can both be used as a basis to build a custom tool or IDE. So they're really kind of the foundation of everything. Usually you use some additional technologies on top of these things, but they really provide you the basic frame to get started. Now, before we dive into the comparison, I would like to, on a very high level, provide an overview of what we are actually talking about. On the left side, we have the yellow box is Visual Studio Code. That's the tool that you can download. That's not an open source project or anything. That's really just a tool that you can download and use. And this is actually built based on two sources. Number one is the Code OSS open source project. And that's actually the thing that I will mainly talk about today. Plus, there is some proprietary code in there. So it's very important to understand Visual Studio Code is not the same as Code OSS, but Visual Studio Code contains a little bit more compared to Code OSS. And now on the other side, we have Theia. On the bottom, we have the Theia platform. That's the open source framework that you can use to build custom tools and IDEs. And on top of that, there are many tools actually based on Theia. One that is openly available is the Theia IDE. It's currently still named Blueprint, but as I announced yesterday, it will soon be rebranded to be the Theia IDE. Sorry. And of course, there are much more tools out there. If you look at the Theia website, you find a gallery of tools that actually use the Theia platform as a basis. Now, this is important to understand. And again, the comparison that I do today is not Visual Studio Code versus the Theia IDE, but I would like to compare the Theia platform and Code OSS to be used as a basis to build your custom tool, because you cannot really use Visual Studio as the basis of your own tool if you want to change something there or adapt something there, right? Because Visual Studio is really something you can only download. You cannot access the full sources of that. Now, when we look at this comparison from the viewpoint of, or in the use case of a platform for your own tool, I select three categories that I would like to do the comparison in. There are, of course, more categories than this, but in previous discussion, I've experienced that these are, from my point of view, the most important one. The first category is adaptability and flexibility. What I mean by that is, how does the platform support your custom use case? How can you adapt the platform? How good is the flexibility to actually achieve custom requirements and not restrict you in what you can actually build with it? Second, very important criteria is the features. So the number of features and the power of features that the platform provides to you, because that's one of the main arguments to use a platform, is that you don't need to start from scratch, but you can actually use a lot of existing things. And this is really important for building tools and IDEs, because nowadays tools and IDEs are really very powerful, and it would be a huge effort to implement everything from scratch. And finally, the third criteria is governance and ecosystem. That's also very important when selecting a platform, because many tools and IDEs that are built out there have a pretty long life cycle, especially compared to, for example, customer or business applications. So tools and IDEs are often not implemented every 2 or 3 years, but they're out there for decades. So it's really important to look at the governance and the ecosystem around the technology to ensure that this technology is healthy over time, that the maintenance can be done, and so on. All right, without further ado, let's dive into the comparison, and I start with adaptability and flexibility. Now, before I dive into the details here, one thing that is important to mention is the purpose of the two projects, and that's these two sentences are actually the first sentences on the website. So VS Code, and therefore Code OSS, which is the code basis of VS Code, is an extensible code editor. And it's actually a great one. It's really super successful tool. Many people, including me, really like it. But that's the purpose. So it doesn't say it is a platform, nor does it say it wants to serve as a basis for you to build something custom. So the idea here is really to create a good code editor, great tool, and make it extensible to certain means so that people can add features to the original purpose, but still being a code editor. Theia, on the other hand, is targeted at being a platform for building arbitrary tools and IDEs. That's really the goal. Now, this distinction is very important before looking at the details, because, for example, I will explain you in a minute why Theia has some extensibility options that VS Code doesn't have. But if we look at the goals in the description of the project, that actually perfectly makes sense. Now, let's look at the extensibility models, so what you can actually do in terms of API, and what do these two technologies provide you. VS Code provides an extension API, and you can develop so-called VS Code extensions that interact with this API and thereby add features to the code editor. And the same exists in Code OSS. That's literally the same. Adding features means, for example, you can add commands, you can add new views, you can react to certain events, add new menu items, and so on. And it's a pretty powerful API, right? So, and this API actually enabled this huge ecosystem of VS Code extensions, for example, for supporting programming languages, linting, whatever. And it has been a very successful model. Now, the design here is really focused on extending something existing, but not changing or adapting something, right? VS Code extensions, for example, run in an isolated process, and they can literally only access the API that has been built for this extensibility use case. Now, from a code editor point of view, this makes a lot of sense because, for example, VS Code extensions, if they behave in a bad way, they cannot harm the stability so much of the original tools. And also, it's hard from a VS Code extension to, for example, destroy the UX of the original tool. Now, very successful model, but it has certain limits, because if something is not available in this API, you cannot extend or adapt it in VS Code. Theia, on the other hand, let's start with a simple one. And we had that yesterday in detail. Theia decided to support the same API for VS Code extensions. Purpose here is, again, to just have access to this huge and very successful ecosystem of VS Code extensions that you can use to add features to your own tool. So this part is similar. However, Theia supports a second extension mechanism, which is more in the core of Theia. In fact, Theia as a platform is completely built based on so-called Theia extensions that you can consider to be modules. So that means the Theia platform is built in a very modular way, and you can add your own Theia extensions to it. And you can also even remove Theia extensions, for example, from example products. Now, Theia extensions work on a different API. They actually work on the same API as the core framework. So there are hardly any limits for Theia extensions, right? It's worth mentioning that VS Code extensions are a runtime extensibility concept, so you can install them in the tool, while Theia extensions are build time extensibility concept. So their purpose here is really to adapt the internals, the core of a tool. Now, much more powerful. Now, because of the second extension mechanism, Theia is inherently more flexible. And the reason, again, is it has been built as a platform. It doesn't want to restrict you on what to do. While VS Code, on the other hand, has this extension model, right? Now, what can you, or what are the examples what you can't do with one or the other? Now, for example, if you wanted to add a toolbar to your product, you can do that with a Theia extension. You cannot do that with a VS Code extension, right? Because you don't have access to the DOM, right? That's really a restriction. Other examples would be if you want to remove something from the existing workbench or change actual behavior, like, for example, how tabs display. You would like to replace the Explorer view. You want to get rid of the code editor. Anything that really deviates from the standard behavior that VS Code wants to see, you cannot do with VS Code extensions, but you can do in Theia extensions. I think a very good example where you can see this in practice is the Arduino IDE 2.0, which is built on Theia. And one thing that I think many people like about this IDE, it has a very simple UX. It makes it very simple to get started with programming for Arduino devices. And one part of this simplification is actually to remove unnecessary things from the UI. We can clearly see that here. It's a very clean UI. You don't have to worry about a lot of views. We have a toolbar with the most important functionality and features. So this is really very good for people who want to get started with programming for embedded devices. And this is built on Theia, and it would not be possible to do that with VS Code. All right, now to tell you the complete story. Of course, and many people might raise this question, you could potentially fork CodeOSS, right? You could take the source code and build in the features that you want, and you cannot do with the VS Code extension API, or you could remove something that you dislike. However, you have to be aware that you are really forking the project and with all the negative consequences. For example, if the original code is changed, you have to rebase, and you're basically alone. Like, you are this elephant completely alone. There's no community around that. And there have been heavy refactorings in the internal code base of VS Code or CodeOSS, and we actually we observed that in customer projects who started to fork CodeOSS that they got into significant problems. Of course, it depends on how big your changes are, but you cannot trust that nothing changes there, right? Because you're not working against an API anymore. So be careful with this option if you deviate too far from the original source code. Now, in a nutshell, for the extensibility, I think it's pretty clear that Theia is more extensible and adaptable, but that's just by nature, right? Because it has been built for this purpose. All right, let's dive into second category, which is the available feature that the platform provides to you for being used in tools that you build upon. Now, first high-level comparison is you will experience that all three things are very similar. VS Code is very similar to CodeOSS. I mean, CodeOSS is the open source code of VS Code, and also very similar to Theia. There are hardly any differences you can find. Of course, there are differences, but all the basic UX, all the basic features are almost identical. The reason for that is, so for VS Code and CodeOSS it's very clear. For Theia, the reason is that when Theia was created, VS Code was already out there. And the Theia developers actually looked at VS Code and said, okay, this is a very good default, right? The UX is great, the feature set is great. Let's just do it the same. And let's just reuse stuff that is there. So, for example, Theia just reuses the code editor provided in CodeOSS because there's no need to re-implement that, right? Theia has a very strong paradigm not to reinvent the wheel and not just to create arbitrary components that are actually already there in an open source version. Now, of course, there are differences. Disclaimer, I cannot mention all the differences. I just want to mention a few examples to actually show you a trend and something that you should watch. There are two features in VS Code that are interesting in this comparison. Live share, the ability to connect different devices and work collaboratively, like in Google Docs. and remote SSH support, which means you can connect your local IDE to a remote container and do the development in a remote container. Now, very cool features, but surprisingly, these two features are not available in CodeOSS. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. The code base, CodeOSS, is not the same as the feature set in VS Code. They're just missing there, right? Because they're not open sourced. Now, what happens then in Theia is that if a certain feature is missing, like live show or remote SSH support, the community may decide, okay, we want that too, even though it's closed source. So we implement a alternative here. And that, for example, happened with remote SSH support this year. So it's available in Theia now. And live share is currently on the way. So it's currently actively developed. So these two features will be soon available in Theia, but again, not in CodeOSS. On the other hand, there are also features that are available in Theia, but neither in VS Code nor CodeOSS. For example, the toolbar that I've shown you, detachable view support is available in Theia since quite a while. I think it has been now announced for VS Code 2. And for example, the ability to connect to several VS Code extension registries. Now, these features actually are supported in Theia for a reason, because the community decided we want that. And in Theia, it's actually much easier to bring in features that certain adopters want. Many of these features are actually optional. So, for example, the toolbar is an extension, right? You don't have to use that in your tool, but you can. It's available. While in VS Code, the decision for the maintainers is often more difficult. For example, the toolbar has been requested there a lot, but they have to decide, okay, do we want to, you could argue, pollute our UX with a toolbar or not? So they really have to do a decision. In Theia, we don't have to do a decision, right? We can provide that as an optional feature for people to use, and they can decide themselves whether they want this or not. So message here is, core message here is, VS Code is not equal to CodeOSS. There are some closed features here, so don't be surprised about that. In Theia, you have a community that can potentially implement features, and that happened in the past. Of course, you will also find features, for example, that are available in VS Code, but not in Theia. But as I mentioned initially, I just want to show you a trend. I cannot compare all the available features. All right, and with that, let's dive into the third category, and that's governance and ecosystem. Now, before we dive into the ecosystem or governance on a high level, let's look at some facts and stats about the projects and their health. So this data is from OpenHub. That's an open source code scanner that provides pretty cool data about open source projects. We can actually observe that both projects are very, very similar. One important detail is we can see that here VS Code has, and that's actually CodeOSS, the open source project, has around 1 million lines of code, while Theia has around a fifth to a fourth of that. So it's significantly smaller. The reason for that is because Theia reuses a lot of stuff, right? So for example, the code editor, which is a significant piece of code. If we look at the active contributors, we see a very similar proportion. So VS Code has approximately 4 times to 5 times more. But if you compare that to the code size, both projects are very similar in terms of activity. And all the other things are very green too: mature, well-established code base, very large development team. We're actually proud on the Theia side that our source code is more well-documented, which makes sense in an open source world, right? Because you want contributors to get easily on board. Now, that's one very important point from my point of view when looking at an open source project is not only activity, but also diversity. Because if only one party is really active in the project, that has potential disadvantage when you adopt a technology. It also has potential advantages, right? Because there might be a lot of money spent by one party, but it's really relying on one stakeholder. And that is actually something you observe in CodeOSS. So if you look at the contributor statistics in CodeOSS, more than 85% of the contributions are from people employed by Microsoft. This is, I mean, it's super great that they do this, and we are really thankful because that really created a lot of innovation in the field of IDEs. But there's not any known, at least not to me any known project maintainer from any other party, from any other stakeholder. There are contributions from other parties, but very occasional, so no strategic contributions that you can actually see in the stats. So it's really an open source project driven by one party. Again, with the advantage that they invest a lot and they actually just do the job, but it's a fact that it's mainly done by them. In Theia, on the other hand, you have constant contributions from a diverse set of companies and individuals. In Theia, there's also, because it's hosted at the Eclipse Foundation, there's a defined process in gaining committer rights. So if you start to contribute and do that for a while, you will eventually get the role of project maintainers. You will gain influence because we have a very open and transparent governance and an open collaboration. So you can get in contact with people, you can influence decisions, and you can really become an influential part of the project. And the core contributing companies over the last year we see down here. Even more on the Theia website, you find a list of adopters and contributors. I've shown this yesterday already, so it's really literally not a one-man show. You see a lot of bigger companies who strategically invest and adopt Theia, which we are really happy about. All right, now let me dive into the conclusion. And I want to mention again the disclaimer that I mentioned or that I raised on slide 1. This is, of course, just the tip of the iceberg. So if you need to do this decision for your own project, you need to dive into the detail. You need to rate the criteria that are important for you. You have to compare your own requirements to the technology to really come to a good decision. And I really want to raise the importance of that again, because typically, as I mentioned, tools are not re-implemented overnight, but it's commitment that you do. So you should be very, you should develop a good trust in your decision before you actually do it. And it's worth spending time. Now, the options that we discussed as a platform for tools and IDEs. So Code OSS, I would say if your target requirement is very close to VS Code, right? If you essentially want to host VS Code yourself somehow and maybe change the logo. And for example, some online IDE providers do that because they basically just want VS Code as is, as close as possible, maybe with a little bit of custom branding. Then Code OSS is probably a good choice, right? Because you cannot get as close to VS Code as just using the code base. There is one risk, though, that you have to keep in mind, and that is actually more and more emerging in the last 1 or 2 years in our observation, that features of the original VS Code tool might not be available there, right? So the promise is not completely true. Even if you use Code OSS, you will not get the same as VS Code. And that might get bigger or not, that's not something we can actually predict. And be aware that customizations might be tricky. We have actually been in contact with people who started a fork Code OSS, I don't know, 4 years ago, because initially they thought, okay, we only want to do very simple changes, but once you open that door, your deviations might get more significant, and then you might end up in a rebase hell. That's really not desirable. So be careful with this. And be aware that you don't have strategic influence or a community, right? Potentially, you might gain that if you contribute a lot. I'm not aware that the doors are closed there, but it just didn't happen yet, right? And there's no community around, for example, maintaining a fork. Now, Theia, on the other hand, if you want to build a custom tool in IDE and you deviate a little bit from VS Code, I think Theia is a very good option. You get something that is as close as to VS Code initially, because that's kind of the default, but you can then deviate from that. Or you can also stay very close to VS Code if you wanted to, right? You can use all the VS Code extensions, so it's very similar. You also potentially have the risk that closed source features that are only in VS Code might not be available. However, you have a community there. And during the last 1 or 2 years, the experience was actually very positive that missing features were actually contributed then by the community if the community found it was important. So you're not alone there, which is definitely a plus. And in Theia, because it's an Eclipse project, you have an open governance, collaboration, and a very diverse community. So you're not only relying on one vendor. They even support providers like us or Typefox, for example, that can help you building a tool, or that can, for example, help you fixing something in Theia, adding features and so on. So it's really an ecosystem rather than a one single project. Lastly, I want to mention a third option for some features, because for some project that might be a valuable option. If you don't want to provide a full tool, but rather a feature that you want to provide to as many developers as possible, think about the option just to provide a VS Code extension, right? And you can upload that to a marketplace, and then people can install it regardless whether they are based on VS Code, on something that is based on Code OSS or Theia, because everything is compatible there, which I think is a really great option in this ecosystem, that we have this compatibility. Of course, that's limited to the available API. So not all the features can be implemented, but for some things, this might actually work. Right, and with that, I would like to open it up to questions. And I think the first question is already there. Yes, it's a long one. Do we have any list of features in VS Code extensions that are not expected to work with Theia or require some changes to make them work? I have a code extension with a web view and was initially using it with VS Code Server, but when I switched to try Theia, it installed fine, but the web view did not work, and I came to know that in the browser context, I needed HTTP to deploy web views. Okay, so in general, and I think that was, so there were 2 talks about this topic yesterday. Over the last 2 years, we have actually worked hard to close the gap here. So in the meantime, we are fully compatible with VS Code. There might be some behavioral gaps, but these would be considered to be a bug then in Theia. So if you experience something like that, I would kindly ask to report a bug, because that's really interesting for the project to know. Also, if you have tried that a little bit in the past, I would recommend to try it with the latest version of Theia, because we literally just closed the gap like 2 months ago completely by removing all the stubs that we had before. So now we actually really believe we are compatible. Of course, there might be some bugs there or some shortcomings, and please report them. That's really valuable information. Second question is, could these open source features developed by Theia community be upstreamed to VS Code? E.g. live share can become FOSS. So for live share, it's actually a little bit tricky, because VS Code already has live share support. And I'm not sure whether they would be interested in having another version. They probably made it not open source for a reason. Definitely the live share version of Theia will be open source. And I think for a live share, it's actually a very interesting option to have an open source version, because especially in a corporate context, you probably want to control the communication there, right? Because potentially proprietary code is sent there back and forth. So we believe having a fully open source version there has a lot of value. So this is probably a feature that is then Theia exclusive, but VS Code already supports that. Question 3, is there shared code between Theia and Code OSS that helps Theia leverage MSF innovations and improvement? Code OSS is an innovative tool with phase-paced development. If Theia needs to follow all the functionalities that will come in the future, it could be challenging. Yes, it could be challenging. But actually, I think we have a good community, and at the moment it's working very well. By the way, it's not necessarily the goal or to always follow exactly Code OSS, right? We have several examples with Theia also implemented something that is not available there. And there might also be features in Code OSS that we decide are not necessary for Theia. That in Theia, that really depends on the community of adopters and contributors. If something is open source in Code OSS, it's typically pretty easy for Theia to adopt. The things that really need to be re-implemented are rather the closed source features. And I'm out of time, sorry. But I think that was it with the question. Thank you very much for attending this talk, and I hope you enjoy the conference day 2 today, and hopefully see you later. Thank you.